this chapter, we're going to take a look at prepping our Drupal site for launch. You've been plugging away for a couple months working on your site. You've got a bunch of content, you got it looking nice, and you're ready to make it live for the rest of the world to see. But before you put it out there for Google to start indexing and for people to link to from their sites and start generating a lot of traffic, there's a couple of last things that you should do in order to prep your site for launch. We'll take a look at configuring error reporting on our site. We'll also take a look at turning on some performance enhancements in Drupal, caching, and JavaScript and CSS aggregation, and talk about what those do. And finally, we'll take a look at a couple of other things that we just want to check and make sure are set before we're ready to launch our site. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to do is take a look at configuring some of the error reporting on our site. If we go to the Configuration tab, and then scroll down to under Development here, we've got Logging and Errors. Let's click on that. And on a production site, it's generally a good idea to set error messages to display to none. What this will do is all of the error messages generated by PHP or those types of error messages, if you can't connect to the database and so forth, instead of displaying those on the page for our users, it'll just write those to the log. They'll still be in our log on the watchdog table so that we can view that information and see when there's errors, but we don't want to show them to users. You can also tell Drupal how many log messages to keep. Generally, I'll just leave this alone. 1,000 is a pretty decent number. If I want to keep, if I'm generating a lot of traffic on my site and I want more log messages, I might bump this up to something a little bit higher. Bump it up one. And then save. So now, whenever there's an error on our site related to something like PHP or database, those errors will get logged, but they won't be shown to users. Another thing that you can do related to errors is if you go to Configuration and then under Site Information, a nice thing to do is set a default 403 and default 404 pages. What this allows me to do is say anytime there's a 403 access denied error, point the user at this page, and I can just specify any Drupal path here, something like node 1, or I might create a node and then alias it to the path 403. 404 is another common one. It's helpful to have custom 403 and 404 error pages because you can be a little bit more descriptive. You can point people to what they might be looking for and that kind of thing. Another one to often forgotten but important setting. Another thing to look at is this email address here on the site information. This is the email address that's going to be used as the from address in any email that Drupal sends out. So I probably actually want to change this to something like webmaster@mysite.com. I probably don't want this to be an individual person's email address, but set it to something like webmaster or info@ or so forth, because this is what it'll show whenever Drupal sends an email, like when a new user registers and resets their password or that kind of stuff. I can go back to Configuration, scroll down again. Again, under Development, there's this Performance link. I'm going to go to the Performance page. We're not going to clear all caches. We'll just skip that one. What we are going to look at is turning on some of the caching settings for Drupal. There's this option to turn on cache pages for anonymous users. Always a good one to turn on when your site's on a production, when you're going live with your site. Turn on page caching for anonymous users. What this will do is Drupal, after it's built all of the HTML that represents a specific page, will cache that HTML. It's just a big blob in your database, and use that to serve to anonymous users who are going to all see the same page anyways. So why go through the work of rebuilding that page every time if we can just build it once, serve it over and over. Another one that is often used is caching for blocks. This is a bit more targeted at sites that have a lot of authenticated users, but this will allow my Drupal site to cache certain blocks, not all of them. The module that provides the block will actually specify whether a block is cacheable, and if it is, how long it can be cached for. But if it can, Drupal will cache the rendered HTML for that block, just like a page cache, but this time we're not actually caching the entire page, just certain portions of it. But again, it allows us to skip things that might be sort of heavy lifting if we only need to do it once. Minimum cache lifetime. The minimum cache lifetime here, minimum cache lifetime is nice for sites that get a lot of traffic that may be causing the cache to rebuild. If your site's generating a lot of content, for example, like new comments on a page will often cause that page to, the cache to expire and it has to be rebuilt. You set a minimum cache lifetime to something like a minute or 5 minutes. That means that when something is cached, it will stay in the cache for at least this amount of time. So if you're getting a lot of misses on your cache, you might consider increasing the minimum cache lifetime. The thing to be aware of would be if I set this to 10 minutes, it's possible that someone could view a page, that page gets cached, and then it won't get updated in the cache until like 9 minutes later. For some sites that might be okay. For others, you might need to have that content be as up to date as possible. And then there's expiration of cached pages. The maximum time an external cache can use an old version of a page. What this one does is actually set an HTTP cache header. And that header is used by external caching systems like Varnish, for example, or Akamai, proxy caches. It's also used by a lot of browsers. It's basically telling those systems how long they can cache the page for. So if I set this to 1 minute, for example, that's telling the Varnish cache that it can only cache this page for a total of 1 minute, at which point it needs to re-request the page and get a new version. So this is useful if you're using an external cache. Bandwidth optimization here. These two are also something that I pretty much just default to turning on anytime that I'm deploying a site to the live server. Aggregate and compress CSS files. Drupal has a lot of CSS files. Your theme probably has a handful of them, and most of the modules that you've got installed also add a CSS file or two. So you're talking, easily 30 plus CSS files. Each one of those translates to your browser or the user's browser needing to make an HTTP request in order to get that file and then use it when rendering the page. If I turn on aggregate and compress CSS files here, what it'll do is Drupal will read in all of those CSS files, and then it'll strip all the comments and the white space out of them and compress it into 2 or 3 large CSS files, but it's taken out all the additional white space to help compress it a little bit, and then it'll just include those 2 or 3 CSS files on the page. This is nice because it's fewer HTTP requests that need to be fulfilled by the server in order to render the page. So it can help with performance, both front-end performance and how fast your browser can render the page. It also helps the server because it's lowering the number of requests that an individual server has to be able to perform in order to serve a single page. Aggregate JavaScript files. Basically the same thing, minus the compression part. The JavaScript aggregator will just find all of the JavaScript files and aggregate them into 1 or 2 really large JavaScript files and cache those, and then just use those over and over. It doesn't do the same stripping of white space and compression that the CSS aggregator does, because we ran into some problems when trying to get that working. It just doesn't do that for now. But for a live site, I recommend having these on all the time. That said, once you've turned these on, it's also important to remember that when you start working on your site in a development environment, you might want to come and turn aggregate CSS and aggregate JavaScript back off, because it'll be really confusing when you start editing a CSS file and hitting refresh and hitting refresh and hitting refresh and nothing actually happens. There's a good chance you've got CSS aggregation turned on and you're just being served a cached version of that aggregated CSS file. In addition to these performance optimizations, I'd also recommend taking a look at the reports here. So go to reports and then status report. I would make sure that on my live site, cron maintenance tasks are working appropriately. There's a previous chapter in this series about setting up cron in search. So I'd make sure that I've got a green here, or I understand why cron isn't running, and I've intentionally done so. But just taking a look at this overall status report and making sure that things on here look good before going live with my site. Finally, another thing that I would do is highly recommend on the modules page. There are some modules that we install when working on a Drupal site that are really for development purposes. The devel module being sort of the big culprit. I would, on my production site, want to make sure that I've got this devel module and all of its related modules disabled. The reason for that is these modules provide a lot of tools that make it really handy for a developer to be able to inspect things on the site, do things like run an SQL query or write some PHP code and see what happens. I really don't want that to happen on my live site. In addition to that, the devel module does some additional logging. Every time someone views a page, it can do things like log all of the SQL queries that were used to generate that page, which is nice in development and for testing, but on the live site, it's just extra overhead that I don't need. There's also a handful of modules like views being one, and you'll often see this pattern of a module like views, where it's the name of the module, views, and then another module, views UI, UI standing for user interface. It's common for really large modules to break up the user interface portion of the module from the part that does the actual sort of business logic. Views, for example, I could turn off the views UI module and all of the views that I had built would continue to function appropriately. So on a production site, I might want to do this depending on whether or not people are going to be editing views on the live site. If they're not going to be editing views on the live site, I might as well just turn the UI off. All of the views I've already built will continue to work, but Drupal won't have the overhead of having to load the views UI module file on every single page request. So we looked at a couple of things, mostly under the configuration tab here. Under configuration, we looked at configuring error reporting so that we're logging errors to the database and not writing to the screen. We also took a look at some of the performance options. We also made sure that we turned off development-only modules like the devel module and checked our status report just to make sure that everything looked good. At this point, I feel pretty comfortable launching the site, and I'd say we're probably good to go.